Welcome back, everyone. Let's continue our discussion about validity, soundness, cogency, and strength. Last time we were looking at some of the exercises in chapter 1, so let's wrap up with a couple more of those. We were looking at in chapter 1, 1.4, covering validity, truth, soundness, strength, and cogency. And we need to do section 5 and 6. So let's look at some of those. This is section 5. It shouldn't be too bad. It's a set of true, false questions. So again, the ones that are highlighted, those are the ones that you are going to have to turn in. And let's get some of your homework done for you. Let's start with number 1. Some arguments, while not completely valid, are almost valid. What do you think about that one? Well, that is false. Validity does not come in degrees. It is all or nothing. So we drew an analogy to two different kinds of light switches. A light switch that is on off is similar to validity being on or off, like a circuit or like a binary code, ones and zeros. It's true or it's false. It's one or it's zero. It's one, it's on or it's off. It's valid or it's not. Strength and weakness, however, do admit to varying degrees. So think of a light switch that has a dimmer on it. So you can fade that light switch on to make it brighter and fade it down to make it dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And that's similar to varying degrees of strength. So the more likely that the conclusion is based on the premises, the stronger the argument is. And just like probability comes in degrees from 0% probability to 100% chances or 100% odds, so too does strength and weakness. So number 1 here is false, but number 2 is true. So number 1 is false, number 2 is true. Let's jump to number 4. If a deductive argument has true premises and a false conclusion, okay, let's just process that for a second. You've got an argument, it's deductive. The premises are all true. The conclusion, however, is false. Does that automatically mean that it's invalid? You can pause and think about it. Yes, it absolutely does. So number 4 is true. Just in virtue of the definition of validity, this can never happen. You can never have a deductive argument where these conditions are met, namely true premises and a false conclusion. Remember our definition of validity here. An argument is valid if and only if it's impossible to have the conditions that we just mentioned. True premises, given the premises are true, and false conclusion. So we could tweak this definition and turn it into a definition for invalidity or invalid, if you like. An argument is not valid. It is invalid if and only if it is possible for the conclusion to be false, given that the premises are true. That would work. So by definition, this is going to be true. So that's 4, true. Okay, great. All right, let's put this back. think there's a typo in here. An argument is invalid if and only if it's impossible. Yeah, there we go. That's good. Let's fix that. Great. Okay, let's do 5. A valid argument may have a false premise and a false conclusion. Now, a lot of students trip up on this sort of question because you see false here, you see false here, and you think, oh, that's got to be detrimental to the validity of the argument. If everything about it is false, then the argument's got to be, either you might say false, even though we don't really say that of arguments, or it has to be invalid. But 5 here is true, believe it or not. 5 is true. And there's a great chart if we scroll up in the chapter. So not table 1-2 about inductive arguments, but the one about deductive arguments here. This goes through all of the combinations of valid or invalid given the variation on whether the premises and conclusion are all true, whether they're both false, whether you have true premises, false conclusion, or vice versa. So what we just described is, remember, a valid argument where everything about it is false. So this would be an example that proves that this can happen. Now, remember, the argument as a whole, it's not good, it's unsound, but it's still valid. Remember, we are separating or divorcing, at least for this class, validity and good, right? A valid argument doesn't mean that it's a good argument overall. A good deductive argument is going to be sound, but a valid argument, as you can see here, can be unsound. Okay, so let's look at this example. I'm actually these are the two premises, and you might have figured out that premises don't have a specific order. So here, this top one, it's listed first. We might call it premise 1, but I'm actually going to read the second premise first because I think it's more helpful to read this first, and I think you'll see why. Okay, suppose that all tigers are flowers. Now, of course, this is false, right? It's not true. There's not even one tiger that's a flower. Okay, but just, grant that for a second. And suppose further that all flowers are dogs. Again, that, of course, is ridiculous. That's totally false. But okay, we're in a weird hypothetical world, parallel universe, where all tigers are flowers and all flowers are dogs. In that wacky universe, if this were the case, then yeah, all tigers would be dogs because tiger means flower, and flower, not mean, but tiger guarantees the thing's a flower. Flower guarantees it's a dog, and so tigers are going to be dogs. So the reasoning or the logic here, that's okay. That's why the argument is valid, but it's not a good argument overall. In other words, it's unsound precisely because it has at least one false premise. And of course, both of these are false. So if we go back to the question, we can now answer it confidently. Our true-false section here. A valid argument may have a false premise and a false conclusion. Yeah, we just gave an example, and it didn't just have a false premise, it had more than one. So that's 6, and that's true. Okay, let's jump to 9. You can work on the other ones on your own. A strong argument may have false premises and a probably false conclusion. So now we're not in the realm of the deductive, we're in the realm of the inductive. So a valid argument can have everything false about it. That's number 5. Oh, shoot, we skipped 6. Sorry, let's do 6. A valid argument may have a false premise and a true conclusion. So similar to 5, but we're going to make the conclusion true. Now, some of you might think, oh, this probably can't happen either. But just like in 5, this is a possibility. So 6, just like 5, is going to be true. Now, how can this be possible? Well, we just need one example because it's may. And again, if we go to this chart, they have some really good examples. So we'll go up to, I think it's 1-1. Chart 1-1, that is, or table 1-1, yeah. And here we want not everything false, but we want a true conclusion, and we still want it to be valid. So look at this argument. And again, I'm going to read the second premise first because I think it helps you kind of connect the poodles to the dogs, which is what we're going to do in the conclusion. Okay. So we're in our alternative universe, and in this weird universe, poodles are flowers. All poodles are flowers. You know, those dogs that are smart and have curly hair and can be small or large, miniature poodle or standard poodle. Assume that those are flowers. And in this wacky world, flowers are dogs. Well, if poodles are flowers and flowers are dogs, well, then poodles are going to be dogs in the wacky world. But hey, that's how they are in the wacky world, and in our world, poodles are dogs. So the logic takes you to this conclusion, which happens to be true. It's kind of like accidentally true. Um, but there's at least one false premise. Of course, both of these are false. Poodles are not flowers, and flowers are not dogs. But when you combine those premises, if you will, um, then we get to this conclusion, which happens to be true, and that tells us that means that 6 is true, which we said it was. By the way, if you can always rewatch what I've just said if you are getting a little bit lost. And if you, I just want to say, if you happen to be struggling, especially with these last few questions, I would tell you to not fret, because these are some of the more difficult questions that we've had in the course so far, and they're up there with some of them. Just conceptually, they're very, very difficult. So if you're struggling with them, don't worry about it. These are really tough. And I would remind you that when you, just to double check, go to these tables, because they will always give you examples that will steer you in the right direction. So that's my recommendation. Okay, let's continue on. And we need to go, we did 6, so 9, which I accidentally started. A strong argument may have false premises and a probably false conclusion. So we're moving from deduction to induction. And just like validity can occur even if everything about the argument is false, same thing with strength. You can have false premises and an unlikely conclusion, and the argument could be strong. And if we scroll up to the chart, it has all those examples of all the combination. And I believe the one for this scenario goes something like, all US presidents have died in office. So that's false, right? Um, Unfortunately, some have, right? Like Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. They were assassinated while they were in office, but not all, right? So many U.S. presidents, um, like Trump and Obama, Clinton, still alive, so they did not die in office. But so that premise is false. But if it were true, if we were in the parallel wacky universe where all former U.S. presidents had died in office, all 40 plus, that's hundreds of years of a track record. If it kept happening over and over and over again, what does that mean for the next U.S. president? Does it guarantee that they will die in office? No, but with that long of a track record, it does make it likely. So that argument is strong. If that were the case, then the conclusion would be likely. But in reality, the premise is false. And what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that the next US president will likely die in office. And in our world, luckily, that is not likely to be true, again, based on the track record. So the premise is false, the conclusion is false. However, the reasoning is still pretty strong. That's why it's a strong argument. So 9 is going to be true, just like 5 and 6. Let's do a few more here. 13, excuse me. If an argument has true premises and a true conclusion, we know that it is a perfectly good argument. So just like five, there's false and false might lead someone to think it can't be valid, but that was incorrect. It could be valid. It's kind of the converse here. You might think true and true. Oh, that's going to mean a good argument, but it doesn't. This is, if you will, half of the battle. What is a good argument? Well, a good argument, yeah, all arguments are deductive or inductive, and good deductive arguments are sound, and good inductive arguments are cogent. So when we say good argument, we mean sound or cogent. And um, while true premises is one of the ingredients of a sound or cogent argument, it's only half the battle. You need a good inference. So you would need it to be valid or strong. So this isn't enough. And even adding true conclusion, that won't be enough. So there are plenty bad arguments that meet these two conditions. And again, if you want proof, go to the chart, and we're going to go to both of them this time. And we want to go to this part where everything is true, but we want a weak argument. So the true false said, if you have true premises and true conclusion, means it's a good argument. No, here's an inductive argument where you have this, and it's an uncogent argument. A few U.S. presidents were lawyers. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think this means some. I think Obama might have went to law school. I think Bill Clinton did too, and there have been others. Therefore, probably the next U.S. president will be older than 40. You see how there's really no connection here. The inference is not good. Talking about them being lawyers to the age, unrelated. So it's a weak argument, but the premise is true and the conclusion is likely. You have to be 35, but I don't think we have elected a president who was in their 30s. I think like Obama, JFK, and Clinton. You could look this up. They were some of the youngest presidents to be elected. I forget who has the record. I think it was JF. It was like JFK until Clinton. Clinton might have beat the record, but maybe he was second. Obama was pretty young, but in any case, there you go. So it has all this stuff, but it's not cogent. And then it can happen in deductive arguments too. All flowers are plants. That's true. All daisies are plants. That's true. Does that mean that all daisies are flowers? Well, the conclusion is true, but just accidentally. It's not true in virtue of the inference from these premises to the conclusion. So it's an unsound argument. It's an invalid argument as well. Everything about it is true. But when we look at the argument's form here, which would be something like all A are B, all C are B, it would not necessarily mean, it could accidentally mean, but it wouldn't guarantee that all C are A. Yeah. So that's our answer to 13. You can have, let me put it to you this way. You can have true premises and a true conclusion and have a good argument. You could, but it doesn't, you can't say we know. It doesn't guarantee it. Some arguments that have true premises and a true conclusion are good, but some are not. So it's not we know. And just a little bit about statements, arguments, true, false, validity. So for our class, a statement may legitimately be spoken as valid or invalid. For our class, at least for this textbook and this system, the answer is going to be no. It's going to be false. So the terms valid and invalid for this textbook and our system and our class, we're going to reserve those. We're going to apply those to arguments, and arguments are a set of statements, not individual statements. So this isn't quite right. Now, if you zoom out, if you talk to other philosophers, other textbooks or other logicians, you might say, well, there's some special statements that we might call theorems that we might say are valid. So this is a little bit depends on who you talk to, but at least in the system, the answer is no. And then 15, an argument may legitimately be spoken of as true or false. Again, for logicians, for philosophers, for this system, for Hurley, for this textbook, we're going to say no, that's going to be false. Arguments, we say, what do we say of them? We say they're valid, invalid, strong, weak, cogent, uncogent, sound, unsound. We don't really say, true or false. That's reserved more for individual statements. So this got crisscrossed here. Statements we can say are true or false. Arguments we can say valid or invalid, but not so much the other way. Again, if you ask non-philosophers or you ask other logicians, people who study logic, they might say, well, you could have a theorem that's an argument that it has it's a single statement, and that statement is true, and the statement has a this is a little bit beyond this class, but the argument, if you look at it, it's a set of statements, and it has a set of premises, it has a conclusion, it has one conclusion, and it has a set of premises. How many premises does it have? It has 0. so if the null set counts as a set of something, which it does in mathematics, then there you go. Then it's an argument, and the statement is necessarily true. But that's kind of beyond this. That's kind of a higher level of logic. So for 14 and 15, we're just going to say false. Okay, let's wrap this up by talking about. I think we're still in 1.4 here. Sorry for the spazzing of windows. Yeah, so we are in 6 here, 1.4. We'll wrap it up. Create the following sound and cogent arguments. So this is kind of cool because up until now, you've been given arguments, you've been given information, and you have to classify and categorize and determine truth or falsity. But here, you're going to have to produce something. You're going to have to create something. So you'll have to do one on your own, a sound argument. Here, you have to do a valid but unsound argument about painters. So what would that look like? Well, it's valid, so you would need the inference of the argument to be good. You would need the inference to be such that if you grant or given that the premises are true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. In other words, if you input truth, you have to output truth. You could go through that test or the tip that I gave you. If you imagine that the premises are true, since it's valid, that's going to guarantee the conclusion. But we want it to be unsound. So that means that at least one premise will have to be false, because if that weren't the case, then this valid argument would have to be sound, but we want it to be unsound. And an unsound argument is either not valid or it has one or more false premises. Since this argument is going to be valid, we need one or more false premises, and we need it to be about painters. Okay, so let's just make one up off the top of our heads. How about this? all painters are women. That's false, right? We want at least one false premise, but we want it to be valid. Okay, so all painters are women. All women are flowers. I don't know, right? It doesn't matter. But if we were in a wacky world where all painters were women and all women were flowers, what would that mean? That would necessitate that all painters are flowers. So the argument is valid, but of course it's not sound because those premises are false. There. So we did it. So practice that with a sound argument about musicians or a weak argument about cooking. All right, that'll wrap things up. We are chugging along here. So that concludes our course on chapter 1. So in the next video, because this section is optional about extended arguments, we're going to move away from arguments. We're going to revisit them, but we're going to take a detour and talk about meanings and definitions, as you can see, which there'll be parts of it that are fun, and also it'll help you in your everyday life and conversations, because how we define things is very, very important. And it turns out that there's not just one way to define things. Just as a teaser, a lot of times people will define things just by giving an example, right? So, if you say like, define a planet by talking about Earth or Mars or Jupiter, that's different than talking about the general characteristics. Something is a planet in virtue of having these defining characteristics. So one is defining by example, another is defining by classifying, what categories it falls into and how it's different from other things, or giving some sort of analysis. And then sometimes we just give another word that means the same thing. Sometimes we give synonyms, right? Especially for words that we might consider $10 words or SAT words or highfalutin words. So like if you describe someone as fastidious, that's kind of a $10 word. That's a word you don't hear every day. And you might like, oh, I don't know what that means. Tell me what it means. And you just say, oh, that's someone who is very tidy and neat and almost OCD about being tidy and neat. That's what it means to be fastidious. So tidy, neat, those are synonyms for fastidious. All right. That's all I've got for you. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.